All right, guys, today we are back to work on the C6 competition drift car build. We had a little bit of a break, got some other stuff done, shop stuff, Miata stuff, and it's time to dive back into this thing. After the last round of clutch kickers, man, I am so excited to get this car done and see what it's like to have that extra power and grip on tap. With the Miata, we're pretty much always maxed out. You know, the grip run for qualifying, it's not much more grip than the max grip we can run, which, you know, normally you loosen the car up for qualifying. We just don't have a big range to work with. We're kind of just stuck with, it's almost on kill mode all the time, and that's really all she's got. So if it's not enough, there's no option to put more in it, if that makes sense. Whereas this car, we should never end up with all of it. And if we do, things are getting wild. So that being said, we're gonna pick up where we left off on the wiring harness. We've got the bones of our interior harness done. That's gonna go to our bulkheads at the front and the rear, and then to the stuff on the inside, like the ECU. So we need to pull this back out. I'm changed my pin up out a little bit. So I had the fans on just one pin, 120 amp channel, but I don't wanna limit myself for adding bigger fans later. The fans that I'm gonna use, we'll probably use these temporarily, and then I'm gonna build a shroud, and I have some 12-inch Mishimoto race fans, which I know the 11-inch ones in my Miata pull about 17 amps once they're going, but these are 12, so it might be a little more. We're gonna be right at that threshold of 20 amps, and if we do wanna put bigger fans on it, if we need some bigger fans, like some 16s, we probably won't really have the option if we're already maxing out a 20 amp channel. So I'm gonna split it to where each fan has two 20 amp channels, so 40 amps total available. So we have that option to upgrade. We just kind of had to restructure the rest of it, where we can use our two 10 amp pins to make a 20 amp channel for some different stuff like the starter and the water pump, the stuff that's not drawing a ton of current and not doing it all the time. So yeah, anyway, I gotta change that up a little bit, and then we need to start looming it. So Sway's gonna go ahead and work on our bulkhead here. We need to open the hole up a little bit so we can pull it out the backside, make building this harness easier. We got some lines to make. We got some fab projects to do. Got a smorgasbord, as we usually do, coming up on the end of this build. But we're closing in on the end of the list here. We can almost cross this one out. We gotta mount the reservoir. This was our second revision of the list, and it's whittling down pretty quickly. So that being said, if we want to whittle it down even more quickly, you need to quit jibber jabbering, get to it. So this was a pretty simple procedure. It always sucks to go back and redo some work you've already done, but I basically just needed to take the fan main 12 gauge wire, cut it where I had it going down to a 16 to go to the pin size, and make it 2 wires, and then rearrange some of the other pins and pinouts and move things around. All right, got this thing repinned the way I talked about, so that's all done. Pretty happy with that. I'm glad we decided to take the time to do that now. So I went ahead and marked where we're gonna basically cut our wires for our back bulkhead. We know it all fits. It's time to pull it out and start looming it, and then terminating it into our connectors at either end. Sway, on the other hand, is working on our last big set of lines. Aside from some wastegate lines, some overall vacuum lines, this is it. And it is our oil feed system. So out of our dry sump pump, it's gonna go into our cooler. It's gonna come out of the cooler, go into the filter housing, out of the filter housing, and into the engine, which that line's already made because it had to be 10 AN line. So it works out anyway because it's got a kind of crazy route to get out of this filter housing. So yeah, he's working on that. We're putting dry brakes in. So yeah, how you feeling, Josue? Dry brake. Woo! I've always wanted dry brakes. It's pretty exciting for me. So yeah, anyway, I'm gonna pull this harness back out and start looming it, I guess. It's time to commit. So installing this loom is kind of a bit like a puzzle. You've basically got to plan it out from the start, because your first branch, your thickest branch, where all the wires are together, that has to go on first. So that has to go on over all of the other little branches, all of the different parts where it segments out, and then so on and so forth. So putting this first initial one on, this is our longest run, and man, it was a challenge. I'm sure there's better ways to do this. If we had used that kind of fishing tape that electricians use to run wire through conduit or something, we figured out a little bit better method, but it was tricky to get that one all the way over. And the thing is, you want to run it as thin as possible so it shrinks really tight, but obviously the thinner it is, the closer it is to the size, the harder it is to get on. So it was definitely tricky, definitely a learning experience. We also had this heat shrink tape that I was going to try to use for the branches. I couldn't quite find the right boot for the branches. Most of the times you would use like this big rubber boot and you would mold it like you do the boots at the connectors, but we didn't have that. So we used the heat shrink tape, which is actually pretty cool stuff. So we get most of the loom on, and now it's time to pin the ECU connector. So I wanted to get this one done so that way I could loom the harness that was going to go from there to the front bulkhead, because some of the wires from the connector go back to the PDM to turn things on and off, say turn the fuel pump on, turn the other fuel pump on, turn the fans on, so on and so forth, and some go forward through the bulkhead and then to the sensors, and those sensors are going to feed back to the ECU. So we've got wires running both directions. I wanted to get both of them loomed separately, obviously. All right, we've got all of our sleeving on the harness, so I'm pretty pumped about this. I've always wanted to do a harness like this. So this is actually shrink flex tubing. A lot of people use in motorsports grade harnesses, as they're called, Raychem DR25, which basically same concept. It's diesel resistant. This is diesel resistant, which that's one of the benefits you get from using the mil-spec wire as well as chemical resistance. So the urge is just to shrink this up right now and see what it looks like. It's killing me. The heat gun's right there. I got this Milwaukee cordless heat gun, game changer. It saves all the hassle. I used it down over there and it seems to work pretty well. So anyway, before we shrink it, we have one more step. We need to pin on our connectors. So we've got our rear bulkhead connector and we have our front bulkhead connector. Now we need to get these on because we need to kind of figure out our exact wire length so that once the boot is on, it will cover everything. And we also need to have these on because the wires are going to kind of need to twist around and move around a little bit before we kind of lock these all in by shrinking this up. So yeah, let's get to it. Just more crimping, stripping, service looping, and pinning connectors. I'm gonna quit jibber jabbering, I'm gonna get to it. So fortunately, the rear bulkhead is all the same size pins and essentially all the same size wire, or in theory, it should be. Well, since our brake lights and tail lights need to go through there, I didn't want to run a separate connector. The connectors with multiple different size pins didn't have enough of the high current pins because we need 7 high current pins. We have 2 fans, 4 fuel pumps, and a water pump. So what I ended up having to do was crimp the small wire into the big pin, which I just added another wire the same size to make sure it got a good crimp. But that one was pretty easy to do because it's only 16 versus 30 or 50, and 2, again, they're all the same size. Aside from those couple wires, but that one was pretty easy. Now we're moving on to the front one. So this one's definitely a bit more challenging, a bit more time consuming. It's 29 pins. We've got a big mixture here. We've got 12 gauge heavy current pins for the intercooler fans and for the starter and for our extra wire. Then we have 16 gauge pins for a lot of odds and ends, like headlights, blower fans, some things like that. And then we've got 20 gauge pins for our sensor wires going to the ECU. Now, unfortunately, we don't have enough 20 gauge pins, so it's another scenario where we've got to use a bigger pin than we really need in a couple spots for the 5-volt reference wire and the ground wire. So same thing. I mean, the easiest way to do it is basically take the one wire that's a little too small, put another wire, similar size or whatever size it needs to be to fill the gap, crimp them, and then cut the excess off. Not the most ideal way to do it. I'd much rather have all the correct size pins, but you're limited to what these connectors can give you, to what these options are. And this was really the most diverse one that I could find that would cover our bases. So anyway, a little tricky, not too bad. Got it all pinned up and we are done. All right, we've got our rear bulkhead connector pinned. Got our front bulkhead connector pinned. Chassis side. We're ready. It's time. We get to do the satisfying part now of heat shrinking all this. So I started off with my sweet new Milwaukee cordless heat gun, and I quickly realized that this stuff was gonna take a lot of heat for a very long time, and I needed to switch to the corded one, otherwise I was just gonna kill the battery because this stuff takes a lot more heat than your traditional shrink tube. This stuff is really, really thick, and I mean, it takes a lot of heat. Having the corded heat gun on full blast, I mean, you're just slowly creeping your way through. It was very tedious and very time consuming to shrink this. I mean, I started burning the table a little bit. We had the AC going in the garage, and I mean, by the end of this, it had picked up 5 degrees plus in the garage. It was a lot warmer in there. I wish I would have thought about that. I should have done this outside, but we got that done, and then I just wanted to add a few Deutsch connectors where these ends were going to different stuff, the small branches that didn't really have a place, so that way this whole harness would be removable. We could unplug it all the way and take the whole thing out together. All right, I got the harness all heat shrunk. Pretty happy with how it turned out, considering we didn't do the proper concentric twist to make it a perfect cylinder. We didn't have the exact size because I didn't want to order a gajillion different sizes. But all in all, it looks good. It's pretty much how I hoped. I added some Deutsch connectors on our leads here. So this one goes over to the wipers and the brake switch. This one goes to the ignition stuff. Boom, boom. So that's done. We can toss it back in and get ready to make the hole for this bulkhead. Josue got the lines done. So it comes out of the oil pump. It's kind of an odd route because of the header and stuff. So tucking it back that way keeps it as far away from the header as possible. Comes up here to the dry brake. Boom, into the cooler. Out of the cooler, through another dry brake, into the filter housing, out of the filter housing, and into the engine. Now show them what it do, Josue. I know you just put this back, so you probably don't want to do it again. So if we need to bypass the oil cooler, disconnect that one. And then, I would add that elevator music, but I got copyrighted for that one time. Then you push this down. We would obviously take the intake off in this situation. Pop it off, takes 2 seconds. There you go.
Because I'm not pulling it. That's because you gotta click it back. I'm still learning quick brake.
What, you've never worked with dry brakes? No. Neither have I. So then there, boom. Now the oil cooler is bypassed. It comes straight out of the pump.
Under the intake.
Under the intake now in this situation. Through the dry brake, into the oil filter, out, into the engine. Now I know this seems complex, but trust me, he mainly, and me as well, looked at this for a while, trying to come up with the best way to do it, because you think, if you were just hooking these lines together with no dry brakes, this wouldn't be that big of a deal. But since you're trying to make it to where this dry brake can reach that dry brake, it gets a whole lot more complicated. And then these lines, you can't make these lines too shorter. They won't have any flex left in them.
And it's better.
Boom. Like nothing. Now this one is a little, I agree. I know it's a little out there, but it happens. There's only so many things you can do. These things are like 6 inches long, so part of it. But I've always wanted to do that, dry brake the oil cooler. So if we ever damage the oil cooler, boom. Or if we're running one event, you know, and it happens to be like 30 degrees out and we can't get the oil up to temp, we could just bypass the oil cooler and run no oil cooler. Because this is a pretty big oil cooler. It's going to do a lot of oil cooling. So just that way, we have that option as well. So pretty happy with that. Pretty happy with that. And if we ever needed to service the front end, that's the other benefit here. We could pop the dry brakes and pull the oil cooler off completely full, completely bled, not have to spill any oil, deal with anything. That means we can take everything off back to the turbo. This whole bracket, all of this can come off out of the way and we can service the car. So it just makes it more serviceable. Otherwise we have to either disconnect the oil cooler and kind of dangle it out of the way or deal with dumping oil everywhere. So same thing with the fender arches where we made them removable. We didn't mount anything to them because as soon as you mount one thing to them, it just makes it more complicated. So since we don't have anything mounted to those, I mean, it would be, I would say 10 minutes. We could have this car from fully dressed to this point, past this point with this off, intercooler off, oil cooler off, everything, and just be able to get in here and get to anything. So anyway, serviceability has definitely been our biggest thing we're pushing for here. It's one thing that the Miata is not. It is not super serviceable. You know, there's just some things that they could fail, and if they fail at a comp, we don't even have a spare because we're probably not going to want to deal with fixing it, you know, because it's going to be a major ordeal. Like if we ate a pilot bushing at the track, that's it, man. We're not dropping the engine out the bottom at the track, you know. So anyway, I'm jibber jabbering. So those are done. I don't know what he's going to get into next, but I'm going to go ahead and toss this harness back in and see what it looks like. Where's the fuel filter? Josue. Fuel filter, Josue. Fuel filter. It's right away, Josue. All right, check it out. Interior harness is more or less done. We got to mount our grounds here, and we got to run these wires. So this one's interior lights. This one goes to our battery isolator up here. We got to do the other end of that up to the wiper section and then down to the brake switch wherever we put that. But look at this, man. I'm really happy with how this turned out. I did make this one section way too long for the inputs into the ECU that go to the bulkhead. That's definitely a little long. Most of these could have been a little bit shorter, but in the grand scheme of things, I'm not mad at it. Overall, the overall length is good. Goes down to the bulkhead, goes over there. Makes me wish I had decided to do the shrink loom when I built this, because I could have shrunk it before I did the bulkhead connector. But yeah, nice and sleek. 80-20 rule. For the fact that we didn't do the crazy concentric twisting and stuff and whatever, like this came out as good as I could have hoped. And then obviously you have this here, but it's just part of it with the service loops and the fact that there's stuff that goes to the front from this connector and stuff that goes to the back from this connector. I tried to keep them separate and have this is the rear, this is the front, but there was just a couple things that had to cross over or tie together, like the headlight, taillight, wiring, interior lights. But overall, man, I'm happy with that. I'm real pumped on that. We got our rear bulkhead in, comes up right here, nice and clean. Boom. Be right here. So this is gonna go over to all of our mini fuel pumps, our fans, and our water pump, and then our tail lights and brake lights. So hell yeah, dude, I'm stoked. This is a big project to get done. I mean, we've still got a good bit of work to do, knocking out the back sections, and we're gonna do them nice. Those are the ones you're gonna see the most. Not bad. I'm pumped. I'm gonna keep telling you I'm pumped if I don't stop recording this soon. All right, we gotta start our list over. This will be the third time probably. Not too long ago though, we had crossed out most things, erased the whole list, and then drew out a new list, and we were almost done with this list. So let me make sure we remember mount batteries, blow off valve flange. Should I have Chrissy write this? All right, list complete. Looks good, looks good. So the next step was going to be building our front and rear harnesses. So to bench build them, we need to know the measurements of the wires so we can get them all cut. So I went ahead and used a small kind of test wire to figure out how long each wire, each branch of wires is gonna need to be so that we could measure that all out, list it, and then cut all the wires to that length. All right, we got our wiring written out for the front, both driver's side and passenger side, and then the rear. We're not splitting that one up by sides. We are splitting the front up by sides because we've got some stuff in this back corner, so we've got to run wiring back there anyway. And instead of having it cross over at the front where it's in the way, if we want to quickly pull all this stuff off, we're going to run a branch to each side. So like this intercooler fan will be on one side, this intercooler fan will be on the other, this headlight, so on and so forth. So we'll have essentially two sides, because I think we're going to put the second sensor block here. We had it over here originally, but the fuel temp's going to go there. Oil temp's gonna go in the block there, so the stuff's gonna be on this side anyway, and we have a little bit more room over here. So I think that's how we're gonna do that. But difficulty is I'm missing things to fully wire out both the front and the rear. So for the front, I'm missing smaller shrink loom. The smallest one I got, for whatever reason, was 3/8, which isn't gonna shrink enough on one or two wires, you know? So we can't really finalize the front yet, but I have the connectors for the front, because everything's going to be disconnectable, obviously. Now the rear, the problem is these connectors aren't big enough. The contacts for these connectors aren't big enough. We need to use these bigger contacts, which are rated to 25 amps each, for the fans, the fuel pumps, the water pump, all that stuff. But we do have the shrink loom small enough for the rear. So I think I'm going to do the rear either way. Just start working on getting that knocked out. So yeah, we got it laid out. I guess let's get to it. The rear should be pretty simple. 4 of the wires go to the same place. 2 of these go to the same place. This one goes a little further. This is really going to be the most difficult part. The tail lights, just because they're small wires and they're going pretty far. I think we can start bench building this thing. So we marked out all of our wire lengths on the table so that way we could just string each wire out and cut it. That's definitely, for me, the easiest way to do it, as opposed to trying to set the tape measure up every time. You know, that's one thing I love about having a wood workbench like this. You know, I don't mind drawing on it, and that kind of adds character. You have that stuff there. Later, we're going to have the whole wiring length of every wire in this dang car just about on this table by the end of this. But yeah, so the rear is mostly heavy gauge stuff. It's almost all heavy 12 gauge stuff, and it's all pretty short. You know, it's a pretty short run to everything from that rear firewall, so it's pretty easy. We don't have to string them out very far. The longest runs are to the tail lights and the brake lights. So we start getting that done. We get all of our wires stripped so we can start pinning them all. Again, nice and easy on this one because they're all the same size pin. So when you have the different size pins like you do at the front, you have to kind of adjust the crimper every time. You got to adjust the depth and how deep it goes, and then the crimp amount, you know, what gauge wire it is. So it's just kind of tedious going back and forth and doing all the different settings. Whereas when they're all the same size, you just leave it the same, boom, boom. And with them being short, it makes it easier to just basically service loop them and toss them in. You know, when you've got a super long branch of a ton of small wires, it's a lot harder to get those service loops in and it not turn into complete chaos. You know, the service loops are cool, and basically the point is so you have a little extra wire if you needed to re-crimp a pin or something like that, and then also to add strain relief, but they do make it difficult to keep things clean, if that makes sense. So anyway, we got it all branched out. We test fitted it back in. It all looks good. You know, we taped it up to where all our branches needed to go. We added in our grounds for each thing to come to kind of a common ground point. So all of that would be all in the same loom. You know, trying to plan ahead is really important with a harness like this, because once you put the shrink loom on and shrink it, there's no way to just add another wire. Like, you're going to have to run it separate. So trying to plan ahead and trying to minimize how many branches we have makes it a lot easier on this part, because you have a branch every 6 inches and you've got a bunch of little pieces and overlapping joints. So try to kind of minimize the branches, bring the grounds out where the fuel pump split off, so on and so forth. So we got that all done, and then it was time to heat shrink it. Or actually, let's be real, it was not time to heat shrink it. You're technically supposed to wait until you add the connectors like we did with the other harness, but I was being a little impatient. I really wanted to see, what this thing looked like, all done and dusted, all shrunk up and all of that nonsense. But I also wanted to just kind of lock it in. I had got all the joints nice and tight, and I didn't want to risk it kind of falling apart and then not being able to get it back that nice. So that's my excuse at least. We went ahead, we shrunk it, put it back in, and started routing it. And man, this is the thing I love about using mil-spec wire in this shrink flex. There's 7 12-gauge wires in there. 7 12-gauge wires, and this loom is nothing. It's so minimal. It's almost like the wiring's not even there. It was definitely the right move. All right, well, the rear section is done, aside from doing the second half, putting the pins on for the connector, and then putting the connectors on, and then building the last bit, you know, for example, from here to the fans, boom, from here to the water pump, put the connector on there, and then boom, boom, right there, perfect. And then from here, we're gonna build a little sub harness. And then same here, this will be a little connector to go up to our interior lights that are gonna be back here. But that way, you know, 1, we can unplug this harness and take it out. 2, you know, for example, if we needed to pull the fuel cell hat, instead of having to undo all these nuts, we would just pop the connector, it'll come right out. So, easy enough. Pretty happy with that. Josue is working on brake line measuring. We're gonna have a place that does brake line. They do them especially for like stock cars, they'll sell you a whole kit. But for this, it's all just race car stuff, all AN lines. But easier to have them make it than to order a bunch of individual lines and end up with getting different colors and different types. So he's coming up with a list so we can order all of our brake lines, get those done. That's one of the last big things. So I think I'm gonna try to start on the front harness. So I need to start stringing it out, measuring it. This is definitely the way to do it. At least if you're building, you know, a whole harness, if you're wiring 1 or 2 things, maybe not. But, you know, I used to always just kind of roughly route the wire, cut it, boom, boom. Or like maybe put one end on, boom, something like that. But to be able to measure, write out your lengths, cut all your wire, and build it all on the bench, it definitely makes the process a lot easier, especially at this level, trying to do the bulkheads and so on and so forth. So I'm gonna quit jibber jabber and I'm gonna get back to work. Let's cut some front wire. This is our pile here. So with how easy the rear was, how few wires, how short the runs were, the front was definitely a good bit more complicated, especially adding in all of those sensor wires for the ECU. You know, it's a bunch of small gauge wires, and then just in general, there's a lot of really long wires in this branch. You know, the one section has to go all the way behind the engine and then all the way up to the front of the car. So it's a bit of a hike for the wire to go. So we marked all of that out. We used silver markers, so now we know which one's which, and got those all cut to length. We went ahead and twisted up the sensor wires for the ECU since they're all going to the same place to keep those organized. And the front wires are cut and done. All right, all of our wires are cut. We got them organized. So this is power, passenger side, power, driver's side, grounds, passenger side, grounds, driver's side. So we've kind of figured out a common grounding spot to run all the individual grounds back to, you know, so say from the intercooler fan, from the headlight, instead of having a branch at every location, we're gonna kind of run them all back to a similar area. There'll be separate grounds, but just that way we minimize the branches on the harness. So I think we've got a good game plan of how we're gonna branch this and so on and so forth. So let's snap our way through this. Let's go from a bunch of cut little wires in a bag. It's crazy to think this is essentially the whole front harness. These four little piles. Let's go from this to somewhat of a harness. Oh, that was a weak snap, hold on. All right, we got our harness as done as we possibly could. We got everything branched, everything organized. We got the loom on that we had the right size of, but again, we really need some real small loom for, you know, these thin sections here. And I wanna, you know, this is the part you're really gonna see. So I wanna make sure every little branch is loomed. Like this one wire needs loom because it's going to the starter. So anyway, pretty pumped on that, went together quick. Happy with how it turned out. Got all our different branches. We got most of it shrink loomed. Still got to throw the grounds in and then finish that out, finish the connectors, but we're not too far off with this, man. And we're pretty much in the same boat with the rear. A couple of sections that need the smaller loom, and then we need a bunch of the heavy gauge connectors. Like pretty much just about everything back there needs a heavy gauge connector aside from the taillights and brake lights. So once all that stuff comes in, we can finalize the harnesses to their termination point, and then we'll just have to go from there to whatever it is. So, you know, just a little short pigtail off the intercooler fan to a connector. So that'll be super easy. So we're almost done with the wiring. It's tedious, it takes forever, but it's honestly been pretty enjoyable. I'm pretty happy with how it turned out. Just a few other odds and ends to do. You know, I've got to connect this wire to the power harness for the dash, and I want to clean that wiring up some and figure out how I want to route it. I want to minimize all, like, you know, coiled up wires back here like I have on the Miata. I'm trying to make this nice and clean with dash on or dash off. We got to run these to the firewall. A couple little things in the wiring department, but we should be able to finish that up. These lines are done. We got the feed line on. We're just waiting on a fitting. It's a weird fitting into here. It's an AN3. It's a 3 ORB to AN. Just odd. But we got the dry brake in here. These lines worked out. Boom. So pretty much all the lines but the vacuum lines are done, and the one steam vent line, but just about all the AN lines are done. Oh, so I also got our brake line bulkheads in and then measured for all our brake line. I'm really excited about that. That was a tedious project to measure and clock and figure out each individual thing to each dry brake. So glad to have that done. That was a big thing I've been putting off doing. So yeah, there's that. Hopefully by the next episode, we should have the exhaust stuff back. The hot side, the exhaust, we can put that back together, finalize the intercooler mount, I mean, and just hammer down for the home stretch, for the finish line, whatever you want to call it. We're close. I know the list looks big, but it's a very detailed list, all this little stuff. So we just got to keep trucking. I think we can get this thing done here soon. So anyway, I'm going to quit jibber jabbering. I'm going to let you guys go, but just wanted to say, appreciate you watching. Appreciate you subscribing. Thank you. I'll see you next time. Goodbye, guys.